Shabbat Shalom. Despite the fact that Debbie and I lived in Chicago for 10 years, beginning in the late 90s, it wasn't actually until this week that I had heard of the 1995 Chicago heat wave. As Dr. Eric Kleinenberg, author of Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, describes, on the first day of the heat wave, Thursday, July 13th, 95, the temperature hit 106 degrees, which, in combination with the humidity, felt like 120 degrees to Chicagoans. That week, roads buckled, train rails warped, children riding in school buses became so dehydrated that they had to be hosed down by the fire department. Energy usage went sky high, leading to a failure of power grids, and so many fire hydrants opened that some neighborhoods lost not just electricity, but water as well. The emergency crews who were called in to seal hydrants were greeted by overheated citizens throwing rocks and bricks to keep them away. Paramedics couldn't keep up with emergency calls, and city hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. Some ambulance crews drove around the city for miles, looking for an open bed. By Saturday, just 3 days later, capacity at the morgue was exceeded by hundreds. A fleet of refrigerated trucks had to be brought in to store the excess bodies. The excess rate that week, Kleinenberg explains, meaning the difference that week in the number of fatalities as compared to a typical week, was 739. That is, 739 Chicago residents suffered heat-related deaths. Government response was both insufficient and tone-deaf, with Mayor Richard M. Daley advising, quote, "Let's not blow it out of proportion. Every day people die of natural causes. You cannot claim that everybody who has died in the last 8 or 9 days dies of heat." If you, like I, had never heard of the Chicago heat wave, part of the reason might be Mayor Daley's callous skepticism. By the end of the summer, Kleinenberg writes, even Chicagoans debated whether heat deaths were really real. Kleinenberg's credentials, however, are not in meteorology or public health. He's a sociologist, and his is a social autopsy of the heat wave, which reveals that it was not just a natural disaster, but a social disaster as well. The mortality rates didn't impact men and women equally, didn't impact rich and poor equally, didn't impact white, black, or Latino equally. Most interestingly, Kleinenberg explains that the disparate mortality rates can be tracked not just by ethnic or economic divides, but also by the degree of social cohesion within afflicted communities. The tight-knit communities, where people checked on each other, enjoyed family ties, shared public space and social services, those were the communities who were able to weather the heat wave more successfully, and less people died. But in the neighborhoods where residents were unassisted by public agencies or community groups, out of contact from family and friends, it was in those communities where residents, seniors and otherwise, died alone, behind closed doors and sealed windows. Drawing on the language of Emil Durkheim, one of the founding figures of sociology, Kleinenberg points to the importance of organic solidarity, the idea that we're all interdependent. It is a key variable to survival, not just in the Chicago heat wave, but in Hurricane Katrina, Sandy, and otherwise. Yes, these calamities reflect nature's fury, not to mention systemic failures of government, but they're also disasters that correlate with the presence or absence of social trust and cohesion, a plague that wasn't distributed evenly, its effect experienced differently by different communities, differences that when it came to the most important difference, life or death, made all the difference in the world. This year, in preparing for all of my Zoom Seders, or Zaders as my children called them, for obvious reasons, like many of us, I found myself absorbed in the 10 plagues. Why did God send the plagues? Why 10? Why these ones in particular, and why in this particular order? Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart with each successive plague? Who was the intended audience of the plagues? The Egyptians, Moses, the Israelites? What do we make of a God who redeems a people by way of inflicting misery upon another people? There are more questions about the plagues than there are the plagues themselves. And as I reread the plague cycle in Exodus, I stumbled upon an aspect of them that I had never noticed before. I noticed this year that there's a critical difference between the first 3 plagues, blood, frogs, and lice, and the rest of them. These first 3 plagues afflicted all of the inhabitants of the land, Egyptian, Israelite, rich, poor, near the Nile, and Goshen, everywhere, everyone, equally. It wasn't just Pharaoh who awoke with frogs on his nose and frogs on his toes. It was every inhabitant. And through these first 3 plagues, Pharaoh's resolve only stiffened. He would not let the Israelites go, not for 3 days, and certainly not for good. It would only be with the 4th plague, Arov, usually translated as swarming insects, that God, by way of Moses, would change tactics. Listen to the language. On that day I will set apart the region of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there. Vesamti pedut bein ami uvein amecha lemachar yeh ha'ot hazeh, and I will make a distinction between my people and your people. In other words, Moses announces the Egyptians would be infested by the insects, but not the Israelites, which is, of course, exactly what happened. A display not just of God's mighty destructive power, but of one population being afflicted and another spared. The results were immediate. For the first time, for a short time, Pharaoh wavered. Go and sacrifice to your God, he says. The Exodus itself was still a ways away. It would take more plagues, hail, darkness, and of course the death of the firstborn. One group targeted, another spared. The point is made explicit in the plague of darkness, Choshech. Lo ra'u ish et echa velo kamu ish mitachtav, shloshet yamim, ulechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. People could not see one another. For 3 days no Egyptian could get up from where he was, but all of the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. It's an intriguing thought to consider, one that I hadn't until this year. Had the plagues befallen everyone equally, we could not say Dayenu. That alone would not have been enough. Only by way of differentiating between communities, by way of distributing the plagues in a targeted manner, would their full terror be realized. That was, if you will, the 11th plague, the coup de grace, the one that made all the difference. Not hail, not darkness, not even the death of the firstborn, but the horrible realization that the destruction was not distributed equally amongst the inhabitants of the land. That is what broke Pharaoh's will. You know, despite what Madonna may have tweeted, it seems to me that the coronavirus is not the great equalizer. As with the plagues of the Passover story, our horror is amplified knowing that whatever the ravages of the coronavirus may be, the fact that its ramifications, medically, socially, economically, are not felt equally by everyone. Of course, our community has been hit hard. I can no longer keep track of the number of synagogue members and their family members who have either tested positive or are presumed positive. As evidenced by the long list of communal passings this week, our synagogue is not immune. The number of deaths, I believe, reflecting a healthcare system stretched beyond capacity, hospitals being forced to prioritize urgent care, and the elderly and ill lacking the support system that would otherwise enable the frail to withstand their infirmities. But what I also know, that terrible as this hour may be, my family, we are amongst the fortunate. To have access to health care, to have access to food, these are privileges that many in this hour do not enjoy. to be able to social distance, to be able to work from home, to be able to work at all. The other day I was sharing with someone the all-consuming efforts these past weeks being made to transform our synagogue into a virtual community, as well as the pastoral demands imposed on clergy during this time of crisis. And this person reflected back to me that at the very least I was blessed to be in a position that was, for better or for worse, in demand. After all, to be busy and purposely deployed is a blessing that many people sheltered in place do not enjoy. And the other day, I shared with a friend the good news and the bad news that I was ordering dinner in that evening. The good news that I was ordering in, putting a restaurant and a delivery man to work. The bad news was that I was ordering in, putting a restaurant and delivery man to work. See, I have the luxury of debating the relative merits of these choices, and if you're watching this from your home, odds are that you do as well. But there is a world out there who do not. This virus isn't hitting everyone equally. It's laying bare racial, ethnic, and economic inequities. It's bringing into stark relief so many societal fault lines that we would rather avoid. Poverty, access to health care, food instability, and otherwise. As I've shared many times, every week my family and I, we sit down and have the tradition of sharing at our table our roses and thorns, the best and worst part of our week gone by. When it was my turn, I couldn't help but make note that my rose was that we were together, healthy, and under one roof. My thorn was that I knew that my blessings, our blessings, were not shared by so many members of humanity. All of which, I believe, brings us back to the plagues. Because if the most frightful aspect of the plagues is the realization that they befell different communities differently, then perhaps the redemptive charge of this Passover is to work to close the gap between communities. Isn't that the whole point of this festival anyway? To remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, and then we leverage that realization towards addressing the condition of those who presently stand at the periphery and are waiting to be redeemed. It's why decades ago we remembered and mobilized on behalf of Soviet or Syrian or Ethiopian Jewry. It's why as Jews we're uniquely sensitive, not just on Passover, but year-round, to the plight of immigrants, refugees, to anyone seeking liberation from oppression of any kind, ethnic, economic, gender, sexual, or otherwise. We recall the Exodus as if we ourselves left Egypt, but we do so to engender in ourselves as an abiding empathy for others, to feel empathy and to act on that empathy in any way we can. And this year, for those of you and those of us like myself who fall in the basket of the haves and not the have-nots, we need to respond with deeds characteristic of our people's spiritual DNA. To give charitably, to give blood, to give time, to give political resources, to give of what we have, to give of ourselves in a manner that both addresses the acute needs of the hour and lays the foundation for a society that seeks to narrow, not widen, the systemic gaps between the diverse pockets of God's humanity. And then finally, there is something that we all can do and must do no matter who we are. As Kleinenberg himself has explained of late, it's altogether unfortunate that in our efforts to flatten the deadly spread of this virus, we've adopted the language of social distancing. What we need, Kleinenberg writes, is not social distancing, but physical distancing. If there's one thing the Chicago heat wave and all such crises have taught us, is that the difference between life and death is not social distancing, but social solidarity. We may or may not have the means to contribute meaningfully to a charity. We may or may not feel comfortable putting ourselves in harm's way. But all of us, I do believe, have the ability to pick up the phone and check in on each other, on the infirm and the elderly, to let people know that we're thinking of them, that we look forward to seeing them, please God, soon, that they are not forgotten, that if need be, we will work with them to identify the right way to get assistance should they need it. And that is my challenge to you. Don't just sit there. Yesterday we began counting the Omer. Today is the second day, 49 days in all between now and Shavuot. A stretch of time, as the Talmud teaches, that another terrible plague afflicted our people. Start tonight. Tack a piece of paper on your wall, write the names down. No less than one person per day, a phone call, an email. The choice is yours, to people you like and even to people you may not like. Why? Because odds are it's those folk, not the other ones, who are not being checked in on. Social solidarity has nothing to do with liking someone. It's about creating a caring community and a caring society. Something I hope we can all work towards. Something that may just make all the difference in the world and in the wilderness ahead. Shabbat Shalom.